Дамы и господа, доброе утро. Я прошу всех рассаживаться.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Please take your seats. We have Mr. Sergei Lavrov, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation. Traditionally, he finds time to meet the Valdai Club members, for which we are very grateful. Sergei Viktorovich will say a couple of introductory words, and then we'll have a Q&A session. I'm ready to make a list of people who want to ask questions. The meeting is in the off-the-record format. We quote nothing from this meeting. Thank you very much. I'm glad to be present here, and thank you for your compliment that I always find time in my tight schedule, to meet you, but it's not my obligation or responsibility. It's an interesting event, truly interesting event. It allows us to enrich our diplomatic thought and gives us interesting ideas for our practical work. The topic that was selected for today's forum is highly important and topical on the nature of today's times and epoch. Some are talking about a long Kondratiev wave, that there's a transition to a new technological conversion, but we are talking about a beginning of the new historical era, and the economic and political reality of recent times is that we are nearing an end of a long time of Western dominance. Even during the Cold War, the discussion was between the capitalistic West and communist ideology, which was also the result of the European political thought. In a sense, it was a discussion about liberal capitalism and its communist alter ego, and our country was trying to do it in a sort of a huge social experiment, and the world of real socialism did influence the West, its development, and contributed to the establishment of that well-being state that became a lighthouse for many. But to think that the liberal capitalism would spread after the end of that standoff and the second stage of globalization brought to the world arena new powerful players that were not rooted in the Western civilization. At the same time, in the US and the EU countries, social and economic processes went not towards increasing the well-being for all, but towards freeing capitalism from state limitations. And the expectations after the Cold War that we had, that there would be a transition to unipolar world headed by the United States, were also an illusion, because the multifaceted nature of international relations made it impossible to control these relations from one center. I mean, national center. And it was obvious that it's going towards forming a polycentric world, even though its specific borders and the methods of reliable control over this polycentric world, which is being formed, are still unclear. And nevertheless, in spite of this objective trend, the Western world and the US found it hard to find peace with the new reality. Let me quote Emanuel Wallerstein, who in 2006 wrote, the US will never reconcile themselves with the loss of imperial positions, and they will try to restore them, which will turn against them, speeding up the decline of their global authority. And this line is continuing. It has been formulated by Obama in 2010 in the Doctrine of National Security, which declared the right of Washington to use military force anywhere if the US believes that their interests are in danger. And the US is allowing itself to use military force without the UN security sanctions. If necessary, Obama, when he became a president, he hinted at switching to a softer course to take a partner's interests in mind, but it did not happen. Much like George Bush, the Jr., he said that the international policy under his administration is going to be humble, but in reality, the course of neoconservatives was exactly the opposite. And the consequences of this line we witness today in the Middle East, in the north of Africa, in Afghanistan, even though in Afghanistan the coalition was present on the basis of the mandate issued by the Security Council. But in practical terms, the national troops of the US violated the norms set for the international humanitarian law. This line was obvious in Europe, and another link in that chain, unfortunately, was Ukraine. We, even before the sincere phrases of John Biden, we realized who is ordering the music in Kiev, and Victoria Nuland, in her conversation with Ambassador in Kiev, revealed that it's sad that we have to pay for the political games by human lives and the destruction of economy in Ukraine. Russia firmly favors the peace in Ukraine and the political process that would ensure settlement there, considering the rights and interests of all regions and all parts of this brotherly nation. In the latest issue of the magazine Russia in the Global Politics, they reprinted the article by Jeremy Shapiro and Samuel, and he is present here, about the development of the situation in Ukraine. And it said that the current conflict could not be explained by fundamental incompatibility of Russia and the West, and the policy of expansion of Euro-Atlantic structures that was conducted during the entire period after World War II has exhausted its capabilities, and we need new agreements that are okay, that Russia and the West are okay with, and that's in line with our thinking. You know about the proposals that President Putin initiated about forming unified economic and humanitarian space from Lisbon to Vladivostok, with using European Euro-Atlantic architecture of equal and inseparable security. But unfortunately, now in Europe, we witness the process of setting new dividing lines. It's really sad, especially against the background of what's happening to the south of the European territory. The face of our Western partners in their ability to change the entire Arab world in the way they want it. And that phase is probably rooted in the rudiments of colonial mentality, when they were trying to justify what was done by spreading the benefits of civilization. This phase leads to serious failures in many situations, not to mention human tragedy and destruction of states. I'm not going to speak in detail about what's happening in Iraq, what happened with Libya, where the insurgents came from who are creating the Islamic State right now on the territory of Iraq and Syria. The first signs of these movements can be seen in Lebanon and Libya, elsewhere, and perhaps some people even say perhaps we should divide Iraq into Kurdish, Sunni, and Shia parts, and by judging by rumors, and I'm not saying they are true, and there is this arrangement now being made. Sunnis are making an arrangement with ISIS, and it's becoming surrealistic. I believe that we need to counteract that by stopping the channels of financial support of radicals and buying energy from them, because there is oil trade. Everyone is aware of that, and everyone knows how much it costs and who buys this oil. We are against the intervention into the affairs of sovereign states. At the same time, we are not saying that we should just step back and do nothing. We are aimed at a consecutive and logical approach that would allow us to strengthen stability in all regions. You don't have to export democracy for that. You need to respect national traditions and help to establish natural forms of democracy which take in those national traditions. It's more complicated. It takes longer than just intervene in Iraq and a month later to declare the victory of democracy in that country, like in 2003. The process of cultivating and fostering local norms is much more complicated and takes longer, and it will not always coincide with the interests of certain politicians who want to prepare for the elections in their countries and want to produce some successes. But this is the only way to ensure stability and security in the countries of a region or globally everywhere in the world. Recently, we initiated, under the auspices of the UN Security Council, to organize a collective analysis of the problems that were created and continue to multiply in the Middle East and the north of Africa, and to think together how these problems can be resolved through the support of healthy, progressive forces, patriotic forces in that region. Overall, we are nearing the line after which we need to organize such a brainstorm, make it inclusive, not try to exclude anyone due to ideological reasons, because the search for strategic guidelines for the 21st century would be our task number one, and we need to start daily and hard work to look for collective approaches in dealing with key issues of modern times. The line after which the control over processes may be lost may be right next to us, and we should avoid self-confidence, which already outplayed humanity in the past many times. And we need to make sure this process is governable. The same goes about civilizational and cultural diversity of the world. This fact cannot be denied. We need to switch this reality to the pathway of partnership, and we don't want this diversity to become the trigger for new conflicts. I was reading the Economist publication, and they said that your attitude to the gay rights is this another fault line. But if you set the question like that, then the crisis is unavoidable. Tolerance is a good thing. It's an important part of today's mentality. But let's admit that in history we have no examples when the rejection of traditional values and the promotion of all permissiveness would coincide with the period of stable and sustainable development. It was exactly the opposite. We have to agree with our right to be different, but we shouldn't impose our views on others. And these proponents of gay rights do exactly that. They impose their views on others, such as you cannot impose your views on anyone in the world in general, and you cannot do it in any specific areas of human relations. Thank you. I hope I did not, I wasn't too tiresome, and I'm ready to answer your questions. Let's reward our colleague for raising his hand first. Thank you for the warm words towards our article. I have a question on other thing. What kind of interaction is possible between Russia and the West under these sanctions? What is Russia ready for with the current external situation? There was this attempt recently to establish this interaction against the Islamic State. It has not worked out between you and your American counterpart. Were there any other opportunities under these circumstances, or is this the bilateral cooperation on other issues is at this point impossible while the sanction regime is in action? You know our attitude towards sanctions. We believe they are illegitimate, illegal, and most importantly counterproductive. The countries that initiated the sanctions suffer themselves. Of course, damage is done to the Russian economy and our financial system, but President Putin already said that the measures that are taken by the government will allow us to overcome these difficulties and come out even stronger and more independent. Because in the modern world, when the main proponents of globalization and free market use such political measures, you begin to think where else this system would take us, where they are in the leading positions. In other words, in any case, independence in economic and financial issues becomes a priority for us, much like it is for China, India, and Brazil, where they have also complicated processes going on as the result of external influence on the situation in the country, including due to the position of the current leadership of Brazil that they took around bugging the phone calls. And that's about sanctions in principle. Now, what kind of actions do we still have? We do not shut any doors. We don't bang any doors. We are open for cooperation in those areas where we have common interests, and the fight against terrorism should be unifying us. We have favored that for a long time, and we did that long before they proclaimed this coalition against one structure, the Islamic State. But this structure is heterogeneous. There are no stable borders or makeup there, neither in the Islamic State, nor in Jabhat al-Nusri, nor in the Islamic Front, nor in the Free Syrian Army. They go where there is more money to get. When the Americans declared the task of fighting against ISIS or the Islamic State, at the same time they declared that they were going to provide financial and material and weapon support to the so-called moderate Syrian opposition, and they said that the Islamic Front was part of that moderate opposition. A few days ago, one of those groups from the structure that the Americans considered to be moderate and trustworthy, one of those groups and several hundred troops moved to the Islamic State, and they have offices of the same Saddam Hussein army that was shut down by Paul Bremer, the general governor of Iraq, who was in control there after the so-called victory of democracy there in May 2003. We need to leave double standards there.
If a person is involved in a terrorist activity, whatever banners he may proclaim, he should be announced our enemy, our common adversary. And we warned about that, and we were not alone about that, and many of you present here warned that the policy of ousting Bashar Assad will bring about the repeat of the Libyan situation, when in order to destroy one person, you would bet on support of extremist groupings. Gaddafi was ousted, and now, according to the United Nations, more than 12 nations suffer from the rebels and insurgents who had ousted Gaddafi. And those fighters, those rebels, are creating a lot of problems for the neighboring nations, using the weapons and warfare which was supplied to them in order to oust Gaddafi. And we called on the world community in order to solve the problems of Syria and to prevent any repercussions to the neighboring countries, to focus on the most important thing, the war on terrorism. Actually, Western nations also realize the importance of that, and I mentioned that more than once. At the most recent meeting of G8, it was Lochbern. It was David Cameron who suggested that the final communique should contain the call on the Syrian government and Syrian opposition to join their efforts in fighting terrorism, and we supported that very much. And after that, we suggested that the same phrase is echoed in the communique of the Security Council, and the British, the French, and the Americans, they refused from that. They said that Bashar Assad is the one to be blamed for the menaces and threats in that region, and this was absolutely illogical. I talked to John Kerry, and really, he suggested that we should think about our potential contribution to fight with the ISIS. And I told him almost the same thing I'm telling you, and I said that we have to come to terms about the notions, about the definitions, not just playing with the words, because we all know about the inhumane killings of the American citizens, and probably under the aegis of the United Nations, and bring together the nations of the region, we could embark on the no-nonsense and conservative negotiation and conversation about some specific actions to be taken. And John, after our meeting, all of a sudden said that we agreed to train Iraqi army, sell warfare, and train special troops and special forces for that country. This is not so. This is not true. I never touched upon this question. I told him at the meeting that we are supplying warfare to Syria, to Iraq, and to other nations, such as Egypt, for instance, in order to strengthen their security and to help them counter the terrorist forces. And answering your question, we will always be open to any suggestions of a fair and just fight with terrorism, but we were not the ones which seized the work of different organizations and different working groups on fighting with terrorism, on the disarmament and security. The working group on the fight with drugs also is not working any longer, and when we are told that let us discuss further reduction in the strategic arms, or let us work in the framework of another working group, we little bit surprised. So if you are interested in that, why do you tend to close all those channels? Why are you curbing our work? We're interested in the joint work, in the joining efforts, not just promoting someone's interests. And if Americans, for instance, need some multilateral coalition in order to promote their interests. Shanshalan, our traditional participant, you're welcome. Thank you so much. So the sanctions are still there, and this is very hazardous, that's clear. But who should do make the first step? I think that Buddhist sutra or wisdom may give an answer. For instance, a bell on the neck of a tiger. Who will untie this bell? The answer is the one who actually tied this bell on the neck of a tiger. Well, tiger's paws are too huge. It would be very difficult. Well, probably it will untie him by accident, but that's evident. I think that the West imposed the sanctions, and the West should lift the sanctions. But Russia, as a very responsible nation, probably can do something in order to facilitate this process, to help your Western partners to decide to lift the sanctions as soon as possible. Probably it would be wrong if I say that we would like to have sanctions stay forever. Probably the United States and other countries would like to have that. I'm not sure about the United States. Probably would like to keep those sanctions intact for more years in order to prevent this single economic area created between the Eurasian Economic Area and the EU. And certainly this unity, this organization may provide appropriate place for all the countries of the region, not just Russia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Armenia. But as for Europeans, certainly we share their aspiration to put an end to these phenomena. And I even read Frank Steinmeier's article, who said that we should think about establishing or re-establishing normal attitudes and relations. And Fico from Slovakia also expressed his views in that sense, and the Czech president also echoed that statement. And when we talk one-on-one, actually, we are praised for supporting the Minsk negotiations, and actually the Minsk Accords were based on the negotiations and phone talks between Mr. Putin and Mr. Poroshenko, and we're still supporting what has been agreed in Minsk. And as Putin said in Milano, we are thinking about the Ukrainian people, not just to appease to anyone. You cannot be indifferent to the bloodshed. You cannot be indifferent when the cities which were built and founded by Russian czars are now destroyed, and the people who are Russian by their culture, and most of them want to be part of Ukraine, but of Ukraine which will treat them equally, treat them as equal citizens, equal to the people who are living in the western part of Ukraine. I think that we have to help Ukraine to reunite. We initiated a document which was called the Geneva Declaration. When I met John Kerry, it was on the 17th of October. And this actually declaration puts in white and black the commitment of Ukraine to start a national dialogue which should be transparent, which should be responsible, and should be aimed at a constitutional reform, bring in to consideration the interest of all the stakeholders. It was, again, 17th of April. That's when this commitment was made, and the process is still nowhere. And after Mr. Poroshenko signed a document on association with the EU in order to create some political background, still did not sponsor this political process. Nothing is done in that respect, and roundtables will not bring about the resolution, or roundtables alone. At least what was tested in June, this was handcrafted, meaning these are actually discussions. They brought together some opposition leaders, but not communist leaders or representatives from southeastern regions. And communists are banned in Ukraine. They are prosecuted. And now again, when we talk one-on-one, we are asked, so let you agree that the OSCE observers come to one checkpoint, to another checkpoint, that the elections are following the templates of the Kiev legislation. And this is a very fragile process, actually. Blood was shed, and it was the fratricide war, literally. Therefore, we have to be very cautious about taking further steps. Let us not put any artificial deadlines. I think that the Ukrainians, they have to settle down this conflict. The representatives from southeast and the Kiev authorities. This is the main essence. This is the main point of Minsk Accords. And we don't want anyone to shift the responsibility to us, including the talk to the self-defense forces. So they now will have their own elections, and the mandate, which was proclaimed, would be supported by the popular vote. Therefore, if our efforts in order to facilitate the peace process in Ukraine give to our European colleagues a reason to avoid this tradition of imposing sanctions, that would be great. If we take a systemic approach, actually, certain problems are discussed within the Security Council of the United Nations, meaning the sanctions and the repercussions and the consequences for the people. Such discussions implied such terms as the humanitarian limits of the sanctions. For instance, when the sanctions were imposed against Iraq, it was specially provided that the sanctions should be aimed against elite. And the same was true of Korea, that the sanctions should not create any problems for grassroots. And then SMOT's sanctions term was proposed. And this wave of sanctions aimed against Russia is more about creating problems for common people, for ordinary people, for the grassroots. So it is openly said that actually the people have to be suffocated so that some social uprising is caused and the current regime is ousted. But I think that such efforts would fail, such methods would not be efficient. I think that the people will actually know what to do. It is very knowledgeable about all those issues. You should not use the metrics which are used in order to cause uprising in some smaller countries. This is a very inefficient and very non-serious approach, and the same had not to be done in Ukraine. This is a big European nation. Well, actually, this is not a small shop, but still you do not have to invite an elephant there to destroy everything there. So, Mr. Pogrebinsky and our Ukrainian colleague, as far as we are talking off record, to pick up this topic of Minsk process, we know that Poroshenko signed into law a decree on the self-regulation, temporary self-regulation in the east of Ukraine. As far as you are talking to your partners, to the Americans, to other Western partners, can you tell us whether they realize that only peaceful settlement may bring about the end to this standoff? Or your partners regard it as a temporary measure that sometime after, probably, order would be set by the official Kiev authorities and everyone would be satisfied? What can you tell us? How would you comment on that? And Yevgeny Kapatko. Mr. Lavrov, I'm not just from Kiev. I lived all my life in Donetsk, and when you say fragile peace, what we see there, actually, the shelling goes on every day, shelling and bombing, so the situation is very, very tense. And several comments, there would be elections on the 26th of October, and you said that the opposition is not involved in the campaign, and sometimes they resort to force. And there is a second wave of the crisis, the economic one, and the situation would be exacerbated. So if, for instance, after the elections, the conflict is escalated, are there any means to prevent that? Because what Michael said, actually, the risks will always be there, and I do think that the risks would be graver eventually, and this is due to the economic situation, this is due to the elections and to the situation after the elections, because many say that there would be more fighting after the elections. Thank you. And that's a very difficult and very multifaceted question, and taking the first question asked by Michael, I feel when I talk to our Western partners that both viewpoints are present. So there are people who realize that those accords have to be brought to their logical end, meaning that all the questions have to be settled down, and there should be a way to coexist on the basis of the direct negotiations and mutual concessions made by the official Kiev and the People's Republic of Lugansk and People's Republic of Donetsk, or LNR and DNR. And there are people who do believe that after the elections, certain agreements would be set, some ceasefire would be set, and then after winter is gone, the Kiev army would be re-equipped or additionally equipped, and the problem would be resolved. And I'm not sure which viewpoint is prevailing. Well, speaking about John Kerry's position, he is a proponent of the process which would be exclusively based on negotiations, because the second option, for instance, the takeover of those territories by Kiev without negotiations, it could be only by means of force, by use of force. And I'm not sure whether this viewpoint is dominating in Washington. There are other people other than John Kerry, who are dealing with Ukraine, including some of his subordinates. And in the Security Council of the United Nations, there are experts on Ukraine and neighboring nations who may share his viewpoint or may not share his viewpoint. I don't think that this country is not interested in any ways of settlement of the conflict based on the use of force, marital. And tomorrow you will have the opportunity to talk to Mr. Putin, and you can find out what he thinks about that. But the fact that there are the so-called pigeons and there are the hawks in the official Kiev authorities, that's an open fact. And even the Western mentors of Ukrainian army, they are quite doubtful about supplying the high-tech and high-precision warfare to Ukraine. There are battalions and some troops which do not obey to the official authorities, and they are sponsored by the private capitals, by the private money, the private sector or the right sector, which is not a hot topic any longer, but still it is there. And they actually, I think that will be those who would like to wage further war even without the order from the commander-in-chief. Sometimes even in order to pose more problems for the commander-in-chief, the president, and stage one more Maidan. As for the elections in LNR and DNR, in Lugansk and Donetsk, this was discussed in every detail at the Milano meeting. And President Putin specified the most important thing. So let us not go into detail about the laws and legislation based on which the elections would be held, whether the people are elected to the local authorities or to some regional authorities. But actually, let us recognize the fact that the territories are proclaimed by, are controlled by the self-proclaimed governments, and they are holding negotiations. So if the Kiev authorities are for the negotiation process, everyone should be interested in having the self-defense troops represented by the legitimate governments. And only elections would be something that would legitimize that. So let us support those elections, that's what we said. Let us not actually call about the names, call about the certain deadlines. So these would be the publicly elected governors of those republics, and they would bear responsibility for what they are to sign.
Yeah, economically speaking, if we take the latest 20 years, there are not that many who did and helped Ukraine that much as Russia did, both economically and politically in every respect, and we still continue doing that. But for that coup that happened just the next day after the agreement was signed and signed by ministers of France, Poland, and Germany. But for that coup, just a month after that, there would be elections where Yanukovych would not win, and then we would continue selling gas to Ukraine for $261 per cubic meter, 1,000 cubic meters. And why all that was done? And now European Union, primarily the European Union, decided to postpone for 18 months, and Yanukovych was torn down actually for the same thing, because he asked for postponing signing the initial agreements. And what we have as a result? Thousands of casualties, thousands of dead, and destroyed economy. Putin spoke about that in Milano, and he underlined that through the state banks, loans are extended so that no demand of debt payment is made right away. We tried to reach some compromise, somewhere midterm, and well, maybe they will be able to find several millions dollars for several months of winter. But when we suggested that, both Europe and America and the World Bank just felt a bit at a loss. So why did you are hurrying us? Well, now you have to look to find $1.5 billion to buy for gas. So what we were trying to do is to promote through our contacts with Kiev and with the European Union a year ago, when all that just began. Tripartite consultations between Russia, Ukraine, and European Union. That was customs union between Russia and Ukraine, and we were just sort of not willing to hear us. Now we're again arriving to the same points. So this attempt to grab the geopolitical space, which is not ready for this change, and which is politically is very contradictory, just to grab it, violating legal interests of Ukrainian neighbors. Well, that's something that future historians should write about in future, but I believe that European Commission caused great damage to the situation and to European Union in particular. We have still 35 minutes ahead, and we have a long list of those who want to contribute. Lord Skidelsky, you're welcome to take the floor.
Mr. Lavrov, you talked about your hopes for a negotiated reconstruction of the Ukrainian state. But isn't there a danger now that the ceasefire line agreed in the Minsk Accords would become the basis of a division of Ukraine into two states with a frozen conflict situation arising if the worst-case scenario that the Kiev government attempts an offensive against the separatist areas occurs? Wouldn't then Russia feel obliged to support the separatists militarily? And what effect would that have on the sanctions regime? Wouldn't that ensure also that sanctions would continue indefinitely? So what is your realistic expectation of the outcome of the Ukraine crisis?
Но вы знаете, тут у вас три сослагательных.
You have three components to your to a question. There are three assumptions, and I want none of them be implemented. We regard Minsk Accords the way they were signed. They are accords between between Kiev and the self-defense representatives, that was ceasefire and withdrawal of heavy weaponry to a certain positions, depending on their diameter of the weaponry. Well, it was so evenly written on the paper, but they forgot about the pitfalls. So when they began to coordinate everything in play, just in reality, then we got to the second memorandum that was signed by on the 19th of October with all coordinates. So later there were some changes or adjustments introduced in reality, on practice. But I hope that in the final fact that will be implemented, and then OSCE observers will go to those territories and be present there, and then that will we do hope that all national dialogue will be launched. You may remember that I said a couple of minutes ago that on the 17th of April, the Kiev government committed to launch this dialogue, but they have not done that yet. But the longer they delay this, more features of a frozen conflict we have. Are there any questions not related to Ukraine? Mikhail Dilyagin. Well, if not on Ukraine, then my question is as follows: do you have an impression that with your you speak different languages with your partners in the West? You're speaking about law and commitments and obligations, interests of peoples and commitments, but on the other hand, the other party says that there's nothing but interests, and not even interests, but some whims. And you speak about law. Okay, do this. Just observe law. But yes. My answer is simple. Yes, I do have this impression. Thank you very much. Joseph Misset.
For your words. You've mentioned the European Union and the European Commission a number of times today. We have a new European Commission. We have a new president for the European Commission, and we have a new person in charge of the European Commission for the External Service. We have 28 new EU commissioners. Do you see any different type of relationship that you can have with this Commission, keeping in mind that yesterday the European Parliament used the word disaster in reference to the Barroso European Commission? Thank you.
Вы меня провоцируете.
Well, you're provoking me. We do hope that the new composition of the Commission will be less ideologically driven and less aggressive with regards to our relationship with our neighbors, and that the Eastern Partnership will evolve towards mutual respect and dialogue on equal footing, and implementation of mutually interesting projects with no infringement on third parties' rights. Latvia that already announced its desire to modernize its Eastern Partnership and turn it into Europe-Atlantic partnership with the attraction of the United States and NATO. I truly hope that after the Lisbon agreements these hopes will not be implemented, but other members of the European Union will become aware of the provocative nature of these intentions that were mentioned before, and the new head of Euro Commission and the High Representative on External Policy and Security, who are very experienced politicians, to my mind, and they are guided by their desire to form a consensus, to my point of view, and with some certainty I can say that the position or the stand in Brussels will take into account the stand of the key players. We all know that what happened, and as we're speaking off record here, when the last package of sanctions at the Euro Council summit was discussed, it was said that it will be implemented depending on the situation as of the end of a week, when plans were made for Minsk meeting, and it was agreed that every head of state should have been consulted, and Van Rompuy issued let that document go, and at least one respected state member of the European Union, represented by its leader, wrote a special letter addressing to Mr. Rompuy, saying that what she thinks about all that. Naturally, they don't want to wash the dirty linen in public, but well, I hope that they will follow, the new leaders of the European Union will follow a very wise approach. The geography of Valdai Club is growing. I would like to give the floor to Telma Lusan from Argentina. She's here for the first time.
My question is about my region. Well, I know everybody knows that the last decades, most of Latin Americans elected anti-neoliberal governments that they have a good synchrony with Russian government. And it was clear the past July during the Mr. Putin visit to our region. So, but I think that also indirectly, the Ukraine crisis has to do with a more influence, because after the sanctions, there was a more intense approach of Russia to our region. So the question is about that. I would like to know if there was a change in the relationship between Russia and our regions, and in general terms, which is the place that Latin Americans have in the Russian foreign policy.
Вы знаете, украинский кризис.
Well, you know that the Ukrainian crisis did not trigger any did not trigger our turn to the Latin America. Well, that happened. That had happened even before. I think that when nearly a decade ago, when in early tens, Russia proclaimed its multi-vector foreign policy, and then we had gained our economic capacity, and politically and through our business structure, we had developed more and more contacts with the countries that are far away from our borders, and I mean Latin American countries and African states as well. So the Ukrainian crisis only strengthened our belief that Latin American countries are our reliable partners. I cannot give you figures off the cuff, but mainly Latin American countries didn't support the anti-Russian resolution that was suggested at the General Assembly of UN, and they either voted against or they abstained, and the whole situation was simplified, and
historical and political arguments and contemporary arguments were not heard, and nobody wanted to hear that the Crimeans would have never accepted the regime that would be hostile to them would abolish just minimal rights to Russians. But somebody said that the law was not signed by the president, but that was promised. That was the first initiative. And when the first agreement was signed by Yanukovych with the then opposition, the first commitment was to set up a government of national unity that will draft a new constitution and run elections, etc. The next day, this agreement was torn apart, and the government building was attacked, and Yatsenyuk personally went to Maidan and said that we formed the government of the winners. Does it make difference, the government of the winners and a government of national unity? Well, you feel the difference. Well, did you expect that the Crimeans would say, come and rule us? Well, that means that people don't understand anything. So we appreciated the position of the Latin America, who is becoming an independent center of the multipolar world being formed. And we're really interested in Latin America through its sub-regional organizations, through its new structure, or CELAC, unity of Latin American and Caribbean countries. Through these mechanisms that you foster and strengthen your cooperation in the region and with your partners, with the Russian Federation in particular. We want you to grow economically, politically, financially. That will be to the benefit of global economy that should have several pillars. We work a lot in the Middle East, and Mustafa Barghouti participated in our conference in Morocco, and he's here for the first time.
Как вы смотрите?
What is your opinion on the collapse of the so-called peaceful process between Israel and Palestine? What measures should be taken by Palestinians in this situation? Well, it's not up to us to decide what Palestinians should do there in dire straits, and the position of the current leadership of Palestinians are not that strong, because people in the street become radical, and Abu Mazen had to give something up in negotiations with the Israeli, but this went off, I think. But we know that there are certain basic points that cannot be circumvented. Principles of settlements were agreed both in the UN resolutions in Oslo and in Madrid, and we cannot waive them. We cannot. There should be the line of 1967, and the refugee issue should be settled, and the status of Jerusalem should be resolved on the mutual basis, and also settlements of the ownership of the holy places in Jerusalem. So we cannot delay. This unsettlements for nearly 70 years of the Israeli-Palestinian problem is, to my mind, one of the factors of instability that allows terrorists to find new supporters. They hint that nothing can be achieved through negotiations, and they use Palestinians as an example. So psychologically, that is a very important factor of finding supporters to terrorists among young people.
Более того, мы всегда
It was a mistake, and in recent years we wanted this quartet to be joined by the representatives of the Arab League, and our Western partners denied that, rejected that, and then they only invited the Arab League after the meeting and tell them what the quartet decided to do. This was not polite, and this hurt the common cause. Instead of bringing the Arab League, it was frozen because the Americans said we needed 9 months, we would resolve everything and we would agree on everything. And you know what happened later. The procedure of transfer of the last group of Palestinian prisoners failed, and the process was stopped. We realize if Palestinians withdraw from the negotiations and decide to act differently with unilateral methods, it will exacerbate confrontation, but it's exacerbated even now due to unilateral actions on behalf of Israel to expand settlements, including in eastern Jerusalem, breaking all the agreements. The Palestinians have only one or two ways out, as they tell us. Number one is to join all sorts of international organizations, except the resolution of the Security Council, the General Assembly, that will declare their statehood, and then turn to the International Criminal Court, appeal to Geneva Conventions on the International Humanitarian Law and things like that. And the second way out is that they also mention simply dissolve Palestinian administration and give the territory to Israel as the occupying country, and let Israel ensure that these settlements and territories are functioning. We spoke with John Kerry about it, and I do hope that we will be able to work out a more collective line than we had so far, because we said that frankly to the Israelis. If the deadlock continues and the Palestinians turn to the UN, we will have no other choice but to support them. We understand very well their dire situation. Rain Müllerson from Estonia, President of International Law in Paris. We are glad to see you in good form, in good shape after so many years. As a lawyer, I dislike the word sanction towards Russia. These are not just sanctions, these are unilateral measures. Sanctions on political issues are approved by the UN Security Council. The EU can have sanctions against France or Estonia when they misuse the quotas for the production of sugar. But sanctions cannot be done against third parties. These are unilateral acts. They can be unfriendly, or they can be violations of the international law. Should we not clarify this terminology here? I agree with you, but this is jargon that is clear to everyone. Yes, at the UN, the unilateral measures were denounced, and in terms of embargo against Cuba, there was a separate item on the agenda about not using unilateral measures of coercion. But it takes longer to say that. But in terms of terminology, yes, I quite agree with you. Stephen Fiedler from Wall Street Journal.
About the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. We've heard senior Russian analysts question its utility. And also we've heard accusations from the US about Russia breaking the treaty in certain cases. Can you explain Russian thinking on this, and whether and when Russia intends to abandon it? And do you actually see it as an essential cornerstone of international strategic security?
Ну, на эту тему уже мы неоднократно высказывали.
We've explained our opinion about this, and President Putin commented on that. That agreement was very important at the historical period when it was signed. It is still of some importance even now. Moreover, since many events happened and such weapons are already owned by 24 countries. A few years ago, Russia and the US offered to make this agreement a universal one. These types of weapons are quite dangerous, and we need to exclude them from the turnover. We found no volunteers to join the treaty. Nobody wants to turn this agreement into a global one and to extend this ban to all countries. And you are quite right, there is still this discussion. Our experts speak up about whether it's right for us to stick to this treaty while so many countries around us already have these weapons, and the US is much further from those countries and cannot be reached by those processes. In the US, there is also a discussion going on. There are proponents and opponents of that treaty, whether to keep it or abandon it. We believe that there is a mechanism that was established through this treaty, and we need to use this mechanism and use it honestly, exchanging ideas. I mean, US-Russian mechanism. Sometimes, periodically, we get our doubts about whether Americans follow it in relation with the deployment of new launch sites units in Europe that can send marine-based winged rockets from the land, which is banned by the treaty, and the testing of missile defense systems during which they use targets of that very range, which is banned by the treaty, and a couple of other issues that are not that are quite substantial. We never politicized those processes. We looked at them within the framework of the created professional mechanism. We did not get any answers. At least we expressed our concerns. The US expressed their concern when we tested a missile which is flying within the banned parameters, and President Obama wrote a letter to President Putin, and then it got leaked to the media. It's not very honest to do things like that. We asked Americans why this was done, and they said, we cannot control everything, we did not mean it, it just happened accidentally. I don't believe in that. President Putin responded to that letter, explaining our position, offering to look at those issues professionally without panic, without using emotions. Otherwise, it looks like a pre-election campaign. And at least the letter of Putin to Obama did not reach the press, the media. There was a round of negotiations in September at the initiated by the Americans, and they sent their experts during that round of negotiations. They promised to give us some documents or other justification of their questions to us. They have not done it yet. They just repeated that they said, we know it and you know it, don't pretend that you don't know it. That's what they said. And we gave them detailed materials about the concerns that I mentioned and agreed on continuing the dialogue. We monitor the situation. We are analyzing it in light of our national interests. I'm sure the US is doing the same at the moment. We have 10 minutes to go. Tamar Gamar, please.
Thank you for your presentation and your responses. My question is related to digital governance. In last Thursday, in a quite good journal, the Commerçant, there was an article about recent agreements between China and Russia in this field. Could you elaborate about this agreement between Russia and China in terms of cyber governance? It's a way for me to ask you if you think that the transformation of ICANN is a good step in terms of global digital governance. Thank you.
Ой, но я не эксперт в этих вопросах.
I'm not an expert in these issues. We have a lot of fruitful initiatives with China, and we are interested, as other respectable countries, we are interested in no one having a monopoly to control internet and the cyberspace. It's not just a desire, it's an issue that is being discussed, has been discussed within the International Union of Electric Communications. They have a certain item in the agenda for everyone to understand how internet is governed or controlled and how each country within this framework can be assured of its security. It's a security issue. Do you remember during the latest summit of NATO in Wales, there was a decision made that extended the Article 5 of collective self-defense to cyberspace. This was an obvious thing, which is no joke. And the international discussion within the framework of International Union of Electric Communications, we support them, and we are in favor of developing mutually acceptable arrangements and approaches to this problem, and we hope that this will be done. As for ICANN, in the context of these discussions, this is something that needs to be discussed also. Many in the West ask themselves, who in Russia defines foreign policy? According to the constitution, it's the president. But what is your role of your ministry? And let me also clarify your issue, your answer to the question of Mikhail Delyagin. When you said that you feel that in the West they speak about interests, and in Russia people think differently. But what about your introductory words when you said that Russia is for non-intervention into the domestic affairs of other countries, but when Ukraine wanted to associate with Europe and you started all this? I'm not sure which legal act has Ukraine made this Western choice. Yes, Ukraine recorded their neutral military and political status in their legislation. Ukraine had negotiations with the EU, but the legitimately elected and recognized president made a decision, because in Ukraine the president also defines foreign policy, and he decided to delay this agreement on association with the EU, and for which he was ousted with direct support of European politicians. Nobody opposed what happened at the Maidan. They all called for friendship. Yanukovych signed this agreement on the 21st of February, signed by Steinmeier, Fabius, and Sikorsky. And according to this agreement, it spoke about national unity as the key for the way out of the crisis. And the next morning he was ousted, and Europe said nothing to express their attitude to what happened. In other words, they supported this ousting. Finally, the dictator is gone. This person who cheated on his own people was a coward. But in that very agreement, Yanukovych gave up all his powers, the right to use force, and he agreed on early elections. He would be gone a month later if that agreement would be observed or had been observed. But I'm not going to repeat myself. And the visits of European ministers to the Maidan, all those things that they did there, Was this not an intervention into internal affairs? Pravый sector, or the right sector, when that coalition declared themselves a winner, one of the coalition members, one of the members of that coalition was Mr. Chagnybok. And I reminded my European partners many times about December 2012, when they had the elections to the Rada, when the Svoboda made it, and the EU made a special declaration against that, and calling all political forces of Ukraine not to cooperate with those neo-Nazis and radicals. But in Austria, when Haider won and he was forced to go out of politics, in this case the EU just said a few words and then reconciled itself with it. Perhaps a political decision was made that in this case, if you can work with radicals, if it helps to separate Ukraine from Russia. Let's think comprehensively. We did not intervene into the domestic affairs of Ukraine. Putin received phone calls. I'm not sure if it's a secret or not. Ask him tomorrow. He got calls from European leaders, asked him to support the agreement of the 21st of February, because we had Lukin, our representative there, and he did not sign it for one simple reason. There was a complete capitulation of that president. We said we didn't want to initial that kind of agreement. Colleagues from Europe called Putin and said, okay, you didn't sign it, at least you say publicly this was the right step. And we did, and the day later this agreement was denounced. And as for Crimea, I already mentioned when the Crimeans understood where things were going, when the government of victors, winners, they what have they won over? They won over Russian language. There were attempts of the right sector to make a breakthrough to the Crimea. Yes, the referendum was quite specific. It happened over a short amount of time, but it was declared and organized by the legislative authorities of Crimea and Sevastopol, elected 3 years ago according to the laws of Ukraine, and no one doubts the legitimacy of that. And we admitted and recognized what we had to recognize. I'm not sure how President will be able to tell you about the things, how things are done before he makes a decision. We have time for one final question. We gave priority to foreigners, and now I give the floor to a Russian. Sergei Viktorovich, it's not about Ukraine. It's really quite threatening about other areas of post-Soviet space. Is Russian diplomacy doing all they can? Can we be proactive? But let me specify. I visited Chisinau in Moldova some time ago. 100,000 people for going to the streets, expressing their desire to be friends with Russia. And there is this problem of Gagauzia with their referendum, and you know the results. There is Transnistria with predominantly citizens of the Russian Federation. It's already blocked by Ukraine. In Moldova, many extreme forces might win, and the potential split, is this worrying you? And what do you think about potential hotbeds of tension elsewhere in the former CIS? This is perhaps the most important question, and of course we are not doing enough due to a number of reasons. When the Soviet Union disintegrated, we had no experts at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for Central Asia or the Caucasus area. We had some people from those areas. They had some links there. They knew how things stood there, but we had to create from scratch this area of diplomatic service. And the diplomats that agreed to go to the countries of further republics of USSR were paid a much smaller salary than those who worked in the West or in the South. Now we adjusted that, and it's much better. It's a challenge for a professional, a very ambitious challenge. But to finance the diplomatic service is a priority for us, and we are thankful to the President for his latest decisions that he made. This helped us to deal with many problems, and people don't have to look for other ways to make a living. But in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we have just as many people as they have in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in European countries, in Great Britain and France. The State Department of the US has many times more employees than we do. If we look at the Central Asian republics, I may be wrong with the exact number, but the magnitude is this. We have about 20 diplomats, and the Americans have 60 diplomats in Astana. How many people they have at the State Department, I'm not sure in the US, but we have 2 or 3 people plus business trips. Someone has a sick leave and vacation, you understand. But it's also clear that working there is not just the responsibility of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It's the responsibility of the President and the government. We have bilateral intergovernmental commissions, regular high-level meetings, and CSTO and Eurasian Economic Union, CIS, several summits per year where all meet, and dozens of mechanisms related to economy and humanitarian space, educational and scientific, industrial committees on all affairs, and the rights of Russian-speaking people. We defend them actively. It's not always simple to do due to a number of reasons. In some countries of Central Asia, the attitude there is looked through the prism of strengthening their independence that they got, and you can still feel that. It's a relatively short historical period, it's natural, but in the majority of cases, the Russian-speaking population is leaving Central Asia. In particular, there are many people who use this program of support or voluntary move. It's not perfect, but at least it's something. When we started it, it was not done well, but now our services are more experienced. The rights of our compatriots, no matter where they live, is a big task for us. Let me say again, I cannot see any dramatic problems there. But in terms of daily issues that we have, should not make it complacent. This is the routine work, but we need to do it, and we can do it and work delicately with those countries. But I will not hide it from you. These countries surrounding Russia are impacted, are influenced by other capitals of the world, and not necessarily in the direction that I'm talking about. As for the specific republics that you mentioned, Moldova, Transnistria, Gagauzia, this is a very serious situation, and I hope the repetition of the Ukrainian scenario will not happen there, even though this wrong logic of either or, to the east or to the west, unfortunately, in Moldova, it's part of the legislative system. The Constitutional Court made a decision that any party that rejects Euro orientation is illegal and cannot participate in the election. What is that? About 7 people in the Constitutional Court, including 6 Romanian citizens. And we need to ask the European Union, what is their response to what's going on? Where is that freedom of choice? And how can they comment on these statements of President Băsescu and Prime Minister Ponta that the final goal is the return of Moldova to their motherland. It's stated openly and no reaction from Brussels, as we have no reactions to the lack of citizenship in Latvia and Estonia. These are all empty conversations. We have mechanisms with the EU, and we ask them questions and they say to us, you know, Romania and Estonia and Latvia, they are members of the EU, and we have our own tools to work with our members. In other words, they are talking only about us during those negotiations. Of course, we don't accept that, and I am convinced that federalization would be a good answer. Unfortunately, delaying with recognizing this reality, you can call it whatever, decentralization, devolution, or whatever. Most importantly, it should be unification of territories that delegate certain mandates to the center, but independently decide their daily issues, on their daily issues. And they're making the same mistake again. Mr. Ivanov is present here. He may recall as he negotiated with Mr. Shevardnadze and Boris Yeltsin and Putin, and at some point Mr. Shevardnadze said the word federation and even confederation, but then other forces prevailed that wanted the unitary state in Georgia, following the ideas of Gamsahurdia, who said Georgia for Georgians. The Abkhaz, they were turned into Georgians during the entire Stalin era, but the federation was not created. Saakashvili decided to re-establish the unitary state by force, and you know what happened. I do hope that this lesson is not forgotten in Chisinau and European capitals that play along the Chisinau lines. And I'm not sure why, but our American colleagues usurped the position of the OSCE representative in Moldova. They keep inheriting it for 24 years. When we suggest there should be a rotation, they decline it, and they ban anyone to offer competitive candidates. The OSCE representatives and countries that delegate their representatives, they are also responsible for avoiding the scenarios of suppressing the people who don't think along the allowed lines. And when we think about federalization and decentralization, let's not be afraid of these terms. Yatsenyuk said, I think, federalization would mean the end of Ukraine as a state. Why? The way out is that Russian-speaking people are for federalization and Western regions are against federalization. If you say that Ukraine may only exist as a unitary state, you only support one part of your country and the rest of your people you despise. And I hope that this will not happen. And the example of Europe and some European countries and the EU itself, this Europe of regions, it's the same kind of movement. Why, when they say that we value the European choice of Ukraine and Moldova, why it has to be against federalization? It's absurd. We are not perfect. No one is perfect. As characters of one movie said, nobody is perfect, but we have what we have. There are many issues, and what you asked is the most important question. Thank you, Mr. Lavrov, for your sincerity. We had a lot of questions. We only made it through half of the list, and please return next year, or perhaps in different formats that we will have together with you in the course of the year. Thank you again, and let me thank all your colleagues from the Department of External Political Planning and embassies with which we cooperate within the framework of the Valdai Club. And as all success to you. Thank you.